On Tuesday, May 8th, I had the pleasure of again dining with Johnson and Mr. Wilkes at Mr. Dilly's. No negotiation was now required to bring them together, for Johnson was so well satisfied with the former interview that he was very glad to meet Wilkes again, who was this day seated between Dr. Beatty and Dr. Johnson. Between truth and reason, as General Paoli said when I told him of it. Wilkes said, "I have been thinking, Dr. Johnson, that there should be a bill brought into Parliament that the controverted elections for Scotland should be tried in that country at that own Abbey of Holly Road House and not here. For the consequence of trying them here is that we have an inundation of Scotchmen who come up and never go back again. Now, here is Boswell, who is come up upon the election for his own county, which will not last a fortnight." Johnson said, "Nay, sir," like a drinking game of every time Johnson said nay goes, "Nay, sir. Nay, sir, I see no reason why they should be tried at all, for, you know, one Scotchman is as good as another." Wilkes said, "Pray, Boswell, how much may we be got in a year by an advocate at the Scotch bar?" I told him, "I believe £2,000. Wilkes said, "How can it be possible to spend that money in Scotland?" Johnson said, "Why, sir, the money may be spent in England, but there is a harder question. If one man in Scotland gets possession of £2,000, what remains for all the rest of the nation?" Wilkes said, "You know, in the last war, the immense booty which Thurot carried off by the complete plunder of 7 Scotch isles, he remarked with 3 and 6 pence." Here again, Johnson and Wilkes joined in extravagant sportive raillery upon the supposed poverty of Scotland, which Dr. Beatty and I did not think it worth our while to dispute. The subject of quotation being introduced, Mr. Wilkes censored it as pedantry. Johnson said, "No, sir, it is a good thing. There is a community of mind in it. Classical quotation is the parole of literary men all over the world." Wilkes said, "Upon the continent that all quote the Vulgate Bible. Shakespeare is chiefly quoted here, and we quote also Pope, Prior, Butler, Waller, and sometimes Cowley." We talked of letter writing. Johnson said, "It has now become so much the fashion to publish letters that in order to avoid it, I put as little into mine as I can." I said, "Do what you will, sir, you cannot avoid it. Should you ever even write as ill as you can, your letters would be published as curiosities. Behold a miracle! Instead of wit, see 2 dull lines with Stanhope's pencil writ." He gave me an entertaining account of Bet Flint, a woman of the town who, with some eccentric talents and much effrontery, forced herself upon his acquaintance. "Bet," said Johnson, "wrote her own life in verse." Oh, there's a footnote about that in a second. "Which she brought to me, wishing that I would furnish her with a preface to it. Ha ha ha," laughing. "I used to say of her that she was generally slut and drunkard, occasionally whore and thief. She had, however, genteel lodgings, a spinet in which she played, and a boy that walked before her chair. Poor Bet was taken up on a charge of stealing a counterpane and tried in the Old Bailey. Chief Justice Sir John Wilkes, who loved a wench, summed up favorably, and she was acquitted. After which Bet said, with a gay and satisfied air, 'Now that the counterpane is my own, I shall make a petticoat of it.'" Here's a footnote. Johnson, whose memory was wonderfully retentive, remembered the first 4 lines of this curious production, which had been communicated to me by a young lady, Professor Tinkers suggests Fanny Burney, of his acquaintance. So this is Bet Flint's life in verse. And the first 4 lines that Johnson remembers. "When first I drew my vital breath, little minikin I came upon earth. And then I came from a dark abode into this gay and gaudy world." It's pretty good. I like that. Talking of oratory, Mr. Wilkes described it as accompanied with all the charms of poetical expression. Johnson said, "No, sir. Oratory is the power of beating down your adversary's arguments and putting better in their place, Wilkes said. But this does not move the passions, Johnson said. He must be a weak man who is to be so moved. Wilkes, naming a celebrated orator, Burke. Amidst all the brilliancy of Burke's imagination and the exuberance of his wit, there is a strange want of taste. It was observed of Appel's vainness that her flesh seemed as if she had been nourished by roses. His oratory would sometimes make one suspect that he eats potatoes and drinks whiskey. Mr. Wilkes observed how tenacious we are of forms in this country, and gave, as an instance, the vote of the House of Commons for remitting money to pay the army in America in Portugal pieces, when in reality the remittance is made not in Portugal money, but in our own specie. Johnson said, Is there not a law, sir, against exporting the current coin of the realm? Wilkes said, Yes, sir, but might not the House of Commons, in case of real evident necessity, order our own current coin to be sent into our own colonies? Here Johnson, with that quickness of recollection which distinguished him so eminently, gave the Middlesex patriot an admirable retort upon his own ground. Sure, sir, you don't think a resolution of the House of Commons equal to the law of the land? Wilkes, at once perceiving the application, said, God forbid, sir. To hear what had been treated with such violence in the false alarm, now turned into pleasant repartee, was extremely agreeable. Johnson went on. Locke observes well that a prohibition to export the current coin is impolitic. For when the balance of trade happens to be against the state, the current coin must be exported. Mr. Beauclerk's great library was this season sold in London by auction. Mr. Wilkes said he wondered to find in it such a numerous collection of sermons, seeming to think it strange that a gentleman of Mr. Beauclerk's character in the gay world should have chosen to have many compositions of that kind. Johnson said, Why, sir, you are to consider that sermons make a considerable branch of English literature, so that the library must be very perfect if it has not a numerous collection of sermons. Footnote here. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not done with that. I'll get to the footnote in a second. Sermons. And in all collections, sir, the desire of augmenting it grows stronger in proportion to the advance in acquisition, as motion is accelerated by the continuance of the impetus. Besides, sir, looking at Mr. Wilkes with a placid but significant smile, a man may collect sermons with intention of making himself better by them. I hope Mr. Beauclerk intended that some time or other that should be the case with him. Oh boy, and now we got quite a little footnote about this part where Johnson said, Why, sir, you are to consider the sermons make a considerable branch of English literature, so that a library must be very imperfect if it has not a numerous collection of sermons. And here's the footnote. It runs about 2 pages here. Mr. Wilkes probably did not know that there is an English sermon the most comprehensive and lively account of that entertaining faculty for which he himself is so much admired. It is in Dr. Barrow's first volume and 14th sermon, Against Foolish Talking and Jesting. My old acquaintance, the late Corbin Morris, in his ingenious essay on wit, humor, and ridicule, calls it a profuse description of wit, but I do not see how it could be curtailed without leaving out some good circumstance of discrimination, as it is not generally known, and may perhaps dispose some to read sermons from which they may receive real advantage, while looking only for entertainment. I shall here subjoin it. I was quoting. But first, said the learned preacher, it may be demanded that what the thing we speak of is, or what this facetious, or wit as he calls it before, doth import. To which questions I might reply, as Democritus did to him that asked the definition of a man, "'Tis that which we all see and know." Anyone better apprehends that it is by acquaintance that I can inform him by description. It is indeed a thing so versatile and multiform, appearing in so many shapes, so many postures, so many garbs, so variously apprehended by several eyes and judgments, that it seemeth no less hard to settle a clear and certain notion thereof than to make a portrait of Proteus, or to define the figure of the fleeting air. Sometimes it lieth in pat allusion to a known story, or in seasonable application of a trivial saying, or in forging an apposite tale, a posite tale. Sometimes it playeth in words and phrases, taking advantage from the ambiguity of their sense or the affinity of their sound. Sometimes it is wrapped in a dress of humorous expression. Sometimes it lurketh under an odd similitude. Sometimes it is lodged in a sly question, in a smart answer, in a quirkish reason, in a shrewd intimation, in cunningly diverting or cleverly retorting an objection. Sometimes it is couched in a bold sheen of speech, in a tart irony, in a lusty hyperbole, in a startling metaphor, in a plausible reconciling of contradictions, or in acute nonsense. Sometimes a scenical representation of persons or things, a counterfeit speech, a mimical look or gesture passeth for it. Sometimes an affected simplicity, sometimes a presumptuous bluntness giveth it being. Sometimes it riseth only from a lucky hitting upon what is strange, sometimes from a crafty wresting obvious matter to the purpose. Often it consisteth in one knows not what, and springeth up one can hardly tell how. Its ways are unaccountable and inexplicable, being answerable to the numberless rovings of fancy and windings of language. It is, in short, a manner of speaking out of the simple and plain way, such as reason teacheth and proveth things by, which by a pretty surprising acuteness in conceit or expression doth affect and amuse the fancy, stirring in it some wonder and breeding some delight thereto. It raiseth admiration as signifying a nimble sagacity of apprehension, a special felicity of invention, a vivacity of spirit, and reach of wit more than vulgar. It seeming to argue a rare quickness of parts, that one can fetch in remote conceits applicable, a notable skill that he can dexterously accommodate them to the purpose before him, together with a lively briskness of humor, not apt to damp those sportful flashes of imagination. Whence in Aristotle such persons are termed Greek words here, dexterous men, and men of facile or versatile manners, who can easily turn themselves to all things, or turn all things to themselves. It also procureth delight by gratifying curiosity with its rareness, as semblance of difficulty, as monsters not far for their beauty, but their rarity, as juggling tricks not for their use, but their astuteness, are beheld with pleasure. By diverting the mind from its road of serious thoughts, by instilling gaiety and airiness of spirit, by provoking to such dispositions of spirit in way of emulation or complacence, and by seasoning matters, otherwise distasteful or insipid, with an unusual and thence grateful tang. I assume not the drink tang, but tang, and another way of tanging. Well, that was a nice little interlude, tangent. Well, what were we talking about? Okay. Mr. Rick Wilkes said to me, this is Boswell now, loud enough for Dr. Johnson to hear, Dr. Johnson should make me a present of his Lives of the Poets, as I am a poor patriot who cannot afford to buy them. Johnson seemed to take no notice of this hint, but in a little while he called to Mr. Dilly, "Pray, sir, be so good as to send a set of my Lives to Mr. Wilkes, with my compliments." This was accordingly done, and Mr. Wilkes paid Dr. Johnson a visit, was courteously received, and sat with him a long time. The company gradually dropped away. Mr. Dilly himself was called downstairs upon business. I left the room for some time. When I returned, I was struck with observing Dr. Samuel Johnson and John Wilkes, Esquire, literally tete-a-tete, for they were reclining upon their chairs, with their heads leaning almost close to each other, and talking earnestly in a kind of confidential whisper of the personal quarrel between George II and the King of Prussia. Such a scene of perfectly easy sociality between the two such opponents in the war of political controversy as that which I now beheld would have been an excellent subject for a picture. It presented to my mind, the happy days which are foretold in Scripture, when the lion shall lie down with the kid. When I mentioned this to the Bishop of Killaloe, with the goat, said his lordship. Such, however, is the engaging politeness and pleasantry of Mr. Wilkes, and such the social good humor of the bishop, that when they dined together at Mr. Dilly's, where I also was, they were mutually agreeable. After this day, there was another pretty long interval, during which Dr. Johnson and I did not meet. When I mentioned it to him with regret, he was pleased to say, "Then, sir, let us live double." About this time, it was much the fashion for several ladies to have evening assemblies, where the fair sex might participate in conversation with literary and ingenious men, animated by a desire to please. These societies were denominated Blue Stocking Clubs, the origin of which title being little known, it may be worthwhile to relate it. One of the most eminent members of these societies, when they first commenced, was Mr. Stillingfleet, Mr. Benjamin Stillingfleet, author of tracts relating to natural history and etc., whose dress was remarkably grave, and in particular it was observed that he wore blue stockings. Such was the excellence of this conversation that his absence was felt as so great a loss that it used to be said, "We can do nothing without the blue stockings." And thus by degrees the title was established. Miss Hannah More has admirably described the Blue Stocking Club in her Bas Bleu, a poem in which many of the persons who were most conspicuous there are mentioned. Oh, I have to go. Well, until next time, bye from Boswell.